In the brittle pre-dawn chill of early May 1944, a low mist clung to the flat fields of East Anglia. It was a silence that felt manufactured, a held breath over damp earth and dormant farmland. The air carried the scent of wet soil and distant cold salt from the North Sea. No birds called. In the half-light, shapes emerged from the gloom, squat, angular, monstrous. Rows of Sherman tanks, their barrels casting long skeletal shadows across the grass. Sentries stood at intervals, their breath visible, their postures rigid. But the sentries did not move. The tanks did not rumble. The only sound was the slow, persistent drip of condensation falling from canvas and rubber onto the ground below. Men moved through this landscape of static giants. They were not tank crews. They wore the uniforms of engineers, of signals personnel, of logistics officers. Their hands were not stained with grease from loading shells, but with ink from minograph machines and paint from careful brushwork. Their fatigue was not of battle, but of perpetual, meticulous fabrication. A corporal knelt beside one of the armored hulks, his fingers probing a seam in the material. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog against the painted canvas. He was not thinking of glory or of strategy. He was thinking of the cold seeping through his knees, of the weight of the deception in his care, and of the distant, thunderous reality that was coming for them all. Pressure built not with explosions, but with the arrival of sealed orders and the tightening of security. Field telephones rang in tents with sides rolled down. Maps were marked not with arrows for assault, but with the precise placement of dummy artillery batteries and phantom headquarters. The men knew their roles: to inflate, to paint, to position, to maintain the illusion. They knew the consequence of a single flat tire on a fake truck left unattended, of a poorly staked tank shifting in the wind, of a careless conversation overheard in a village pub. German reconnaissance aircraft were a constant, humming threat in the high clouds. Each man, while adjusting a guy wire or stenciling a unit insignia, would feel the skin on his neck prickle, imagining the eye of a camera lens far above, dissecting their performance. The silence was now punctuated by the sporadic, deliberate noise of their craft, the hiss of air compressors, the low murmur of rehearsed radio traffic broadcast from loudspeakers hidden in woods. It was a stage being dressed under a watchful, unseen audience. Across the Channel, in Berlin and Berchtesgaden, another kind of pressure was building. The German High Command stared at maps plastered with intelligence reports. They saw the buildup in Kent, the tanks, the fuel depots, the troop concentrations reported by spies and glimpsed in aerial photographs. The Allied Army, General George Patton's formidable 1st U.S. Army Group, was massing there. It was logical. The Pas de Calais was the narrowest point. The beaches were suitable. The Phantom Army, constructed of rubber and radio waves, grew more real with each passing day. German analysts pored over the details, connecting dots that had been painted for them. Panzer divisions were held in reserve, waiting for the obvious blow. The clock ticked down. The real army, millions of men and mountains of real steel, was massing 200 miles to the west in absolute radio silence, waiting for a storm that would not break where the enemy was looking. Then, the morning of June 6th arrived. The real invasion crashed onto the beaches of Normandy. A continent shook, and in East Anglia, the men of the Ghost Army held their breath. This was the moment of supreme vulnerability. Would the ruse hold for a few more hours, a few more days? The order came down: intensify the show. Dummy landing craft were ostentatiously assembled in the Thames estuary. Radio traffic concerning the postponement of the Calais operation was broadcast with deliberate, breakable encryption. The fake headquarters crackled with fake urgency. Every soldier tending to an inflatable tank knew that if the Germans saw through the veil now, if those Panzer divisions roared west towards Normandy's fragile footholds, the blood of thousands would be on their hands. Their war was one of perfect, silent tension, measured in the tautness of a rubber skin. The consequence was not a battle, but an absence. The Panzers did not move. The German High Command, convinced the Normandy landings were a feint, a brilliant, bloody diversion, kept its strongest forces locked in place around Calais. They waited for the main event, for Patton's ghost to lead his rubber legions across the narrow sea. For 7 critical weeks they waited. The men in East Anglia maintained their vigil, pumping air into sagging tanks, repairing canvas torn by the wind, acting out the greatest military deception in history. Their success was measured in the continued slaughter on the Norman hedgerows, where Allied soldiers fought without the full weight of Hitler's armored fist descending upon them. Aftermath settled over the fake camps like the ever-present mist. The news of the fierce fighting in France filtered in, a grim counterpoint to their silent theater. There was no celebration, only a hollowed-out fatigue and the slow, somber understanding of what their illusion had cost the enemy and what it had spared their own. The inflatable tanks began to sag, their seams weathering. The painted insignia faded under the summer sun. The men who had tended them moved with a quiet purpose, deflating the giants, packing away the wires and compressors. They folded the war that never was into wooden crates. The fields returned to grass, scarred only by the impressions of countless tires and footprints, soon to be erased by rain and time. The silence that remained was different. It was no longer a held breath, but the quiet after a verdict had been passed. They had built a mirage that bled an army dry of time and opportunity. And as they packed up, they glanced one last time at the empty fields, knowing the real war was elsewhere, its outcome still hanging in the balance, but its course had been subtly, irrevocably bent by an army of ghosts. The focus shifted westward, to the real steel and blood. But the ghost army's work was not yet done. Its very existence had to be preserved, a lingering threat in the enemy's mind. So the men remained, a skeleton crew amidst a deflating spectacle. They became curators of a decaying fiction. Daily they would walk the lines, re-inflating a Sherman here, repositioning a dummy artillery piece there, ensuring that from the high altitude of a passing Junkers reconnaissance plane, the tableau still thrummed with potential. The effort was exhausting, a peculiar psychological grind. They were maintaining a lie whose truth had already been revealed, betting that the enemy's belief was so deeply rooted it would outlive the evidence. In Normandy, the consequences of their fiction manifested in the mud and bocage. German tank commanders, awaiting orders to counterattack the beachhead, fumed as headquarters debated the location of the true, decisive strike. Precious days dissolved into arguments over phantom army groups. When German intelligence intercepts of the fake radio traffic were presented to Hitler, he slapped the map table and insisted the main attack was still to come. The men in East Anglia, unaware of the specific paralysis they caused, felt it in abstract terms, a dread responsibility. A sergeant, meticulously airbrushing mud and wear onto the pristine canvas of a dummy tank tread, would pause, his hand trembling not from cold, but from the surreal disconnect of his task. The wear he painted was an artistic flourish. The wear on the real tanks in France was etched in metal and blood. His brushstrokes were part of the equation that kept a certain percentage of German 88mm shells from finding real targets. Then came the subtle shift. The pressure was no longer about preventing discovery, but about managing the lie's slow, credible death. They could not simply vanish. A ghost that disappears raises more alarm than a ghost that fades. So they staged a gradual drawdown. Trucks, real trucks moving dummy equipment, began to depart at night. Selected inflatables were left slightly deflated, giving the impression of a unit preparing to move out. The radio traffic diminished in volume, but not in urgency, now speaking of redeployment and consolidation. It was a delicate ballet of staged withdrawal, every move choreographed to feed the German obsession. They were not just building an army anymore, they were meticulously disassembling one under a watchful, paranoid eye. The human cost of this theater was a quiet, corrosive strain. These soldiers never heard a shot fired in anger at their position, but they lived with a unique brand of fear. It was the fear of irrelevance, of failure measured not in lost ground, but in lost belief. A mistake in their pantomime could translate into battalions overrun on a French hillside. This knowledge sat in their stomachs like a cold stone. They developed a 1,000-yard stare not from witnessing horror, but from imagining it happening elsewhere because of them. Theirs was a war of nervous systems, stretched taut over weeks of mundane, high-stakes fakery. Sleep was fitful, haunted not by nightmares of combat, but of a canvas tank bursting with a loud pop at the exact moment a German spy plane flew overhead. Meanwhile, the actual front solidified. The Allies broke out of Normandy at Saint-Lô. The German grip on France was fracturing. And still, a significant portion of the Wehrmacht's best forces remained in the Pas de Calais, gazing across the water at the empty yet seemingly potent shores of England. The Ghost Army had achieved something beyond tactical surprise. It had induced a strategic paralysis. The inflatable tanks and plywood aircraft had become prison guards, holding entire divisions captive to idea. The men who tended this grand illusion began to hear the reports of the real advance, of liberated towns and fleeing German troops. There was no sense of victory in their compound, only a profound, weary disbelief. They had won a battle of perception, and the prize was the continued echo of their own fiction. One morning in late August, the orders finally came. The operation was terminated. The remaining decoys were to be dismantled with immediate effect. No fanfare, no ceremony. The air was let out of the final tanks with a long, sighing hiss that seemed to last for hours. Canvas was folded. Wooden frames were broken down for firewood. The field, once crowded with the silhouettes of armored might, lay exposed and empty under a wide, gray sky. The men worked in near silence, their movements efficient, their faces closed. They were dismantling the evidence of their own war. As they loaded the last lorry, a rain began to fall, a soft, steady rain that would wash away the tire tracks, fill in the impressions, and return the field to the farmers. They drove away, leaving behind only mud and memory. The Ghost Army had served its purpose. It had bled the enemy of time, of option, of certainty, and now it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. Its only legacy written in the altered calculus of 100 battles it never fought. But the story did not end in that empty field. It echoed in the shattered remains of the German defensive line in France, a line that had been weak where it was struck because it was strong where it was not needed. It echoed in the bewildered interrogations of captured German officers from the 15th Army in the Pas de Calais, who spoke of the immense Allied force that never materialized. And it echoed in the minds of the deception soldiers themselves, men who would carry the strange, weightless truth of their service for the rest of their lives. They had not stormed beaches or liberated towns. They painted, pumped, and pretended. And in doing so, they had held real divisions in thrall, their greatest weapon not the explosive charge, but the persuasive idea. The war moved east towards the German border, a tide of grim reality. Behind it, scattered in warehouses and depots, lay piles of carefully folded rubber and canvas, the dormant, deflated skeleton of a victory won in the realm of pure thought. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where a colossal fiction had lived, breathed, and changed the course of history. The dismantling was merely physical. The psychological footprint of the Phantom Army remained, pressed deep into the German command structure like a fossil in stone. In headquarters far from the silent fields, staff officers pored over now useless maps, the markings for Patton's ghost formations, a taunting testament to their own gullibility. A profound, sickening disillusionment set in. It was not merely a military defeat they grappled with, but an intellectual humiliation. They had been outwitted not by a superior force of arms, but by a superior force of imagination. This cognitive rupture had consequences that rippled forward. Orders were questioned. Intelligence was viewed with corrosive skepticism. The very fabric of command confidence, already frayed by setbacks in the East and the bombing of the homeland, began to unravel from within. The deception had sown a seed of paranoia that would yield a bitter harvest in the battles to come, making German commanders hesitant, second-guessing every Allied move as another layer of an infinite ruse. For the architects of the deception in London, the aftermath was a quiet room filled with cigar smoke and the heavy weight of success. There were no medals struck for Operation Fortitude, no public parades for the men of the Royal Engineers Camouflage Corps, or the radio specialists who had woven the tapestry of lies. Their victory was classified, locked away in filing cabinets stamped with the highest secrecy. They moved on to other problems, other deceptions, but the scale of Fortitude South would never be replicated. It existed as a perfect, singular artifact of war, a confluence of artistry, technology, and profound understanding of the enemy's mind. The men in those rooms allowed themselves no pride, only a cold, professional satisfaction. They had turned Hitler's own certainty, his fixation on the logic of the Pas de Calais, into the weapon that gutted his defense. The greatest trick was making the enemy convince himself. Back at the camps that had housed the Ghost Army, nature began its reclamation. Weeds grew through the hard standing where lorries had parked. Birds nested in the eaves of abandoned storage sheds that had held countless cubic feet of folded canvas. Locals who had been told nothing but suspected everything now walked their dogs along the perimeter fences, gazing in at the emptiness. They had seen the tanks, heard the engines, observed the busy soldiers. Now they saw only grass. A surreal quiet settled over the villages, more profound than the silence that had preceded the buildup. The war had come to them as a pantomime and left as a whisper. For the children who had watched the strange, silent tanks from afar, it became a confused memory, a dream of a war that was all costume and no violence, a spectral prelude to the very real news of casualties read from the pulpit on Sunday. The men who had served there scattered to other units, other fronts. They carried with them a peculiar disconnect. In barracks or on troop ships, when soldiers swapped stories of combat, of close calls and horrors witnessed, these men had nothing to offer but the truth, which sounded like fiction. They spoke of inflating tanks in the rain, of the eerie sound of fake radio traffic echoing across empty fields at dusk, of the constant gnawing fear of a single mistake. Often they were met with puzzled stares or dismissive jokes. They learned to keep quiet, to hold their strange service close. Their trauma, for it was a form of trauma, was of sustained, high-stakes unreality. They had lived for months inside a collective fiction, their every action a performance for a deadly audience. Returning to a world of straightforward cause and effect, of tangible objectives and clear enemy lines, was a difficult adjustment. The real war felt almost simpler by comparison. As the Allied advance pushed into the Low Countries and Germany itself, evidence of the deception's success was physically uncovered. In abandoned German command posts, maps were found still pinned to walls, the Calais coast heavily annotated, the markings for the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group faded but legible. Intelligence officers collected these artifacts, cold proof that the mind game had worked. More telling were the interrogations of captured generals. Their bitterness was not solely for the forces that had defeated them on the ground, but for the shadow forces that had misdirected them from the air and the ether. They spoke of the Second Army with a lingering, resentful belief, as if it had been unfairly kept from the battlefield. The ghost, it seemed, was harder to kill than a living soldier. The machinery of deception itself was carefully archived. The molds for rubber tanks, the designs for inflatable aircraft, the scripts for radio deception was carefully archived. But its essence, its soul, could not be boxed and stored. It resided in the lesson learned, that in modern war, the battlefield is not merely land, sea, and air, but also the mind of the opposing commander. The successful invasion of Normandy was a colossal feat of arms, of logistics, of courage under fire. But it was also, fundamentally, a feat of narrative. The Allies had written a story so compelling, so meticulously detailed, and so perfectly tailored to the audience's expectations that the enemy based his entire reality upon it. When the real story began on the beaches of Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold, and Sword, it was too late for the audience to change the channel. For the common German soldier stationed along the cliffs of Calais, the aftermath was one of crushing anticlimax and then sudden, violent redeployment. They had spent months fortifying positions, mining beaches, sighting artillery, watching the horizon for the armada that never came. Their morale was a mix of taut readiness and deepening suspicion. Then, as the true front collapsed in Normandy, they were ripped from their concrete fortresses and thrown into a chaotic, desperate movement east, not as a coherent defensive force, but as scattered fragments rushing to plug a disintegrating line. Their great purpose, to repel the main invasion, had been a fiction. Their concrete bunkers, overlooking the empty sea, became monumental tombstones for a strategy that had never existed. The psychological blow of realizing they had been guardians of a ghost coast, while the real war was lost hundreds of miles away, was demoralizing in a way no physical defeat could match. The final silent partner in the deception was the sky itself. The Allied air forces had played a crucial, unspoken role. Their reconnaissance flights carefully avoided showing too much interest in the fake army, lest that interest seem staged. Their bombing campaigns in the Pas-de-Calais were calibrated, enough to suggest preparation for a landing, not enough to destroy the ports they would ostensibly need. Even the pattern of destruction was a lie. And the Luftwaffe's own reconnaissance pilots, those who made it through the gauntlet of Allied fighters, brought back photographs that were studied not for what they might conceal, but for what they seemed to confirm. The sky, a medium of truth through photo reconnaissance, had been turned into a carrier of falsehood. The very tool the Germans relied upon to pierce the fog of war had been co-opted to thicken it. And so the legacy of the 1,000 inflatable tanks was not measured in square miles taken or enemy divisions destroyed in battle. It was measured in time. The 7 weeks of strategic paralysis granted to the Allies in Normandy allowed for the buildup of an irresistible force, the capture of Cherbourg, the bloody grinding through the Bocage, and ultimately the breakout at Avranches. That time was purchased not with blood on those fields, but with the intellectual currency of a flawless illusion. Every hour the panzers waited was an hour the beaches became a fortress, An hour the mulberry harbors were assembled. An hour the avalanche of men and material grew from a foothold into a flood. The Ghost Army did not fire a shot. It simply existed, and by existing, it altered the clock. In war, time is the most precious commodity of all, and the Ghost Army stole it in plain sight. The final chapter of the story is written not in the archives, but in the quiet of subsequent decades. The field where the tanks once stood is now productive farmland once more. The villages nearby sleep undisturbed by the ghosts of military traffic. Veterans of the real fighting return to Normandy beaches as pilgrims. But the veterans of the deception had no monument to visit, no hallowed blound to touch. Their battlefield had vanished, leaving no scar. Their service remained a curious footnote in regimental histories, a classified secret long after the war ended, known only in its broadest outlines. They took their peculiar knowledge to their braves, the knowledge that they had fought a war of shadows and won, that their most powerful weapon had been a shared, meticulously constructed dream from which the enemy chose never to awaken. The ultimate testament to the operation's success is its obscurity. The great thunderous events of D-Day and the Normandy campaign rightly dominate the historical memory. The deception that enabled it remains in the background, a subtle, almost whispered prologue. It is the hidden foundation upon which the loud, violent edifice of the invasion was built. To understand D-Day fully, one must understand not only the courage on the beaches and the chaos of the hedgerows, but also the silent, empty fields of England, where an army of artists and technicians painted a target on the wrong piece of coastline, and in doing so, drew the enemy's gaze and held it, fixed and unblinking, until it was too late to look away. The war was won by soldiers, sailors, and airmen. But first, it was won by magicians. And when their final trick was complete, they packed away their props and disappeared into the silence from which they came, leaving only history and the faint, indelible impression of 1,000 inflatable tanks on the damp English earth.